The ceasefire is ending. Negotiations appear weak. The Strait of Hormuz is under blockade. Will the US and Israeli regime's war against Iran resume? Who will strike first or who will blink first? Tel Aviv, Washington, or Tehran? And on a lighter note, welcome to our followers on YouTube, on our new channel. Don't forget to subscribe. Carl Zha is a geopolitical analyst and host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Carl, welcome. In one line, if you can, how would you describe these 40 days of war for non-experts, for your average Joe, if you like?
What we're witnessing is actually the collapse of the U.S. empire in West Asia in real time. The United States has never faced a serious opponent, despite the claim of having decades of combat experience. It turns out those combat experiences were against goat herders and people's weddings and funerals. This is the first time the U.S. is fighting an opponent that has access to satellite intelligence. And U.S. military installations have been blinded all throughout the region. There's reports from the Wall Street Journal that says 13 of U.S. bases have been rendered basically uninhabitable. This is a war that the United States started, but it's not a war that U.S. will be able to end on its own terms.
Okay. Do you, Carl, see this as a regional conflict, or is it part of a broader, how should I say, greater power competition between China and the United States?
Well, Iran started the war as a regional power in West Asia. As the war progressed, the United States had made Iran a world superpower. A famous line from the famous sci-fi book Dune, those who can destroy a thing controls it. Right now, Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is a lifeline, which is the lifeblood for the world economy. And 20% of the world's hydrocarbon resources, particularly oil and gas, has to goes through the Strait of Hormuz. United States basically conceded the control to the Iranian military. There's nothing that Trump can say or do to alter that fact.
We will expand on that later, hopefully, in the program if we have time. Do you think Beijing views Iran as a pillar of resistance against U.S. hegemony? And should that pillar collapse, that China will be next?
Well, first of all, Iran is an independent country that always treasures its own sovereignty and independent foreign policy. There's a lot of talks from the West talking about Iran as some sort of proxy for Russia and China versus the United States. This is simply not true. If anything, Iran is a partner. Iran is a inheritor of ancient civilization. It has always been a regional power, and Iran has proved itself more than capable in the recent fighting against the United States and its allies. And for China's part, China do not wish to see instability in West Asia, instability that was brought on by the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran and southern Lebanon. And China has a traditionally friendly relationship with Iran. I mean, this stretch over 1,000 years to the time of the Silk Road and continues today. It's not in China's interest to see a regime change in Iran by Washington or Tel Aviv. So just like China do not wish to see Russia fall in its struggle against NATO, China do not wish to see Iran fall against the United States. So China will do its part to help Iran to sustain this fight.
Sorry to jump in, Carl. Does Beijing, has it crossed, do you think, the Chinese officials' minds that Iran is standing on perhaps behalf of Asia, resisting U.S. hegemony, and should Iran fall. I mean, it's not going to, but let's say hypothetically that should Iran fall, that China will be next. Are they intertwined?
Well, I think that's obvious for any observers of the geopolitics today. You know, the grand prize for U.S. supremacy has always been to subjugate China, to reduce China, what they perceive as its peer competitor, to a vassal status. You know, the way to China is through Moscow and Tehran. You know, this is why they wage aid, they provoke Russia into a war in Eastern Europe, and why they attack Iran now.
Yeah. You see, Carl,
this is also trumpet.
Sure. You see, Carl, many Iranians are that I've spoken to are saying we signed so many defense agreements, MOUs with China regarding security and everything, and not that we needed Chinese help during this war. Iran proved itself capable, but where was China on the military front?
Well, China has been supplying Iran with a chemical precursors that was necessary to make missiles, which is one of the most important weapons in Iranian arsenal. You know, we've seen the performance of Iranian missiles throughout the war, and that's what's keeping the U.S. Navy at bay right now. China has been continually supplying those chemical precursors before and after the 12 Days War. This has been, again, widely reported in Wall Street Journal. So Iran also uses
Carl, just to put this
China's...
Sorry to jump in again. Once again, apologies to jump in again. Just to put this argument to bed, and perhaps you can present it to the Iranian people on this program better than, you know, it's an opportunity to present to the, you know, a Chinese view. That was what the Wall Street Journal reported. Is not official. Is not what officials have said. What China has provided is not. I mean, Iran could have perhaps purchased elsewhere. Getting to the point of where I was actually asked, that what many are asking on the streets of Iran is, where was China militarily to defend Iran during this war? We just saw statements. That's the viewpoint.
Right. Okay. China's military is not designed to fight a long-distance expeditionary war the way the United States military is structured to, because China is not an empire the way United States is. China's military is designed to fight a defensive war on China's perimeters, and that China can do very well. But China do not have extensive military bases throughout the world in West Asia like United States does. You know, for example, the only overseas Chinese base is in Djibouti, and China simply does not have that capability, because that's not the capability that Chinese military is intended for. You know, it's not intended to fight a long-distance expeditionary war the way that United States military is designed for. So what China do is to leverage its strength, which is in the field of economics. China buys 90% of Iranian oil, which sustains the Iranian economy all throughout decades of Western sanction. And China continue to do so. This is the area where China can leverage its greatest strength to help Iran, including providing Iran with the necessary ingredients to make to power its missiles. You know, on the other hand, China do have placed export control on rare earth minerals. You know, to prohibit their sale to the U.S. military-industrial complex, which is causing a huge headache for the U.S.-Israeli military right now, because they cannot replenish all these ammunition that have been depleted during this war.
Sure. So just to put this argument to bed, and we've seen China historically, it's not like the United States. It has a UN peacekeeping force. It plays a role in the UN peacekeeping, keeping the peace in Africa. But just to put an end to this argument, China doesn't come to the defense militarily like of its allies. even despite the risk that one of those allies is a key pillar standing in the face of US hegemony, even to that extent, at that level, at those
Well,
risks,
China
considering that
supports its
that
ally
America will come back and,
differently.
yeah, considering that,
China supports its ally differently, right?
yeah,
I mean, this is the same way China supported Russia during the war in Ukraine. China, by providing Russia with the economic lifeline to sustain the Russian economy, so it does not face collapse in the face of the Western sanctions. Again, people expect China. I think it's unreasonable for people to expect China to behave exactly like United States. That's not the role that China ever intended to play. Is to be like opposite of to be another global hegemon like United States. This is why the whole reason Chinese military is not structured to project power into other part of the globe. Its Chinese military is designed for a defensive warfare capability around its neighborhood, the same way the Iranian military is designed to fight.
fair enough, absolutely. Now, Carl, in your view, what has been the most critical changing points in this conflict, in this war to date? Bearing in mind that at the beginning, Trump expected nothing less from Iran but total surrender.
Well, I think, one thing that we have learned is, there's a almost tired refrain coming from the Western imperialists is that those natives, the only language those natives understand is a power of force. It turns out that's a pure 100% projection. Iran has negotiated in good faith with the United States on the nuclear issue for decades. Yet all it received in return, it was tearing up of the JCPOA by the first Trump administration and further U.S.-Israeli aggression against Iran. And guess what? The moment that Iran did to exercise its right of defense by closing down the Hormuz Strait, suddenly United States is singing a different tune. It turns out the only language that Washington understands is the language of force. And now that Iran has finally chose to exercise its force, Trump is forced now to come to the negotiation table.
Right. We'll get to the negotiating table. Just expanding on my earlier point, Carl. Initially, Washington's rhetoric was on regime change in Iran, limiting or destroying Iran's military assets, nuclear claims, and so on, among others, many others, of their war goals. Why have these objectives now suddenly shrinked or have been limited to the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, because the United States have finally realized limit to its capability. Trump went into this war thinking this would be a quick victory. This is why the United States launched the war without even bothering to fill up its strategic petroleum reserve, which has been drawn down since the Biden years in order to win election, appease the voters. And but I think the whole Venezuelan operation has really gotten to the heads of Trump administration. They thought they could do a quick decapitation strike against Iranian senior leadership that will make the rest of the Iranian government fall in line. That didn't happen. It turns out Iran is a proud country, a proud independent country that was more than capable to defend its interests. And now we're at the situation where United States had been exposed as a fragile paper tiger, as it cannot defend its extensive military bases in the region that was built up through decades. The whole premise of U.S. alliance in the West Asia is that U.S. is supposed to provide a security umbrella to countries like GCC. It turns out by having U.S. bases on your soil is not providing a shield, but rather a liability that makes you a target. And this is causing assessment among so-called U.S. allies all across the world. Even people in East Asia, they're watching and reassessing their options because they understand what Iranian missiles were doing to U.S. bases in West Asia. Same thing would happen if a war were to break out between U.S. and China over Taiwan, all the countries in the region that host U.S. bases, from Japan to South Korea to the Philippines, all those bases will be lit up on fire.
This shift in America's weakness that you noted, some might argue that it's calculated. Would you go along with that?
I'm sorry?
This shift that we're seeing in America's what you described as weakness, the shift in position from what it wanted at the beginning, the war objectives that it sought at the beginning, to where we are now, just concentrating on the Strait of Hormuz. Some would say that is calculated. Would you go along with that?
I mean, there are many spins coming out of Trump administration and Trump administration aligned neocon think tanks trying to spin this as some sort of five-dimensional chess by the Trump administration. It's just simply untrue. Currently, the Trump administration is threw feces on the wall to see what sticks right now, because they really did not plan to have the war drag on like this. Originally Trump had planned to travel to China. At this point, he has to publicly announce delay of his trip, because it would not look good for him to travel to Beijing, meet Washington, while U.S. military bases are getting pummeled in the Persian Gulf, and he will meet Xi Jinping with a very weak hand.
What's happened to that trip? When was it scheduled for? Just for our viewers who don't know, he delayed it. He postponed it during the war. When is it scheduled for?
Well, originally it was supposed to happen at end of March and early April. Well, as it was announced by the White House, as we now know, White House is not really a credible source, because for the Chinese side, they never publicly confirmed the dates. Even now, the official Beijing line is that they're working with U.S. officials on the planned visit by Trump. But so far, it's only Trump administration had released the dates. Now the dates have been pushed back to May, to middle of May.
I see. So Trump's meeting with President Xi in May, potentially on the cards, not hearing much from, or the vague statements from Beijing. Carl, what has the closure, do you think, in your opinion, in the Strait of Hormuz, what has it done to the global energy market over the past 40 days?
Well, I mean, this is a severe energy shock. Because, as I mentioned, when 20% of the world's oil and gas come from the Persian Gulf region, and people are now belatedly realizing the importance of hydrocarbon in everyday life. I mean, we're talking about not just fuels, but also chemical fertilizers. This is now it's a spring planting season. Farmers all around the world depend on those chemical fertilizers that was synthesized out of oil and gas. And this goes to chip production, helium, which again is synthesized from gas, is used to make advanced semiconductor chips. Again, was supposed to be the backbone of the AI revolution. Like the huge portion of the U.S. and Western economy right now that goes into fueling the AI bubble. Right now, that AI bubble is in serious jeopardy, because AI is very energy intensive. First of all, they're not getting the energy. All these data centers of these AI companies are getting destroyed in the Persian Gulf, and they're not getting enough helium to manufacture additional to keep up the supply of the advanced semiconductor chips to power the AI revolution. So the whole world economy is getting impacted.
God forbid the AI bubble bursts. Who's going to write those posts on social media, the bots and what have you? Why is it, Carl, in 2026 that this specific stretch of water is still so existential for the global economy, not just the region?
The global economy still very much depend on cheap energy coming from the Persian Gulf. We have not move beyond petroleum in terms of modern life. People have to realize the industrial revolution happened when humanity moved from traditional source of energy to high to fossil fuel, to coal, first to coal and then later to oil and gas. These are the components that powers modern life. And right now the crisis at Strait of Hormuz is putting that on hold.
Do we know if any countries have actually benefited from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? And do we know which countries have been affected the most?
Well, I mean, Russia obviously stands to benefit, and Iran also benefited, ironically, because the whole Strait of Hormuz crisis has prompted U.S. Treasury Department to issue a sanction waiver against purchase of Russian and Iranian oil. Like all these. That Iran wasn't able to accomplish through decades of negotiation with the United States happened overnight as a result of this war. The U.S. now have lifted the sanction on Iranian oil and gas because they realize that's the only way the U.S. ally will have access.
How does that backfire so spectacularly in the face of the U.S. administration when it sets out to wage a war? An illegal war, albeit, against Iran?
Well, we are not dealing with very bright people in Washington, right? These people have not thought this war through. Like I say, it was very poorly planned and poorly executed. They thought Trump understanding of the U.S. military power is what he understands from ingesting Hollywood propaganda, like Top Gun, from the original Top Gun from the 1980s, and this you will know this by watching press conference given by Trump and his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. That's a perception of reality. It's through Hollywood, which is very different from the reality on the ground of the U.S. military today. And this is why we're in the mess we're in right now, because they did not plan for this. They thought it would be an easy victory falling into their lap when that didn't happen. Now they're just scrambling. They're scrambling. The objective of the war have shifted from originally regime change in Iran to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But let's remember, Strait of Hormuz was open before the illegal war U.S. and Israel waged on Iran.
I mean, if this closure were to continue, this closure of the Strait of Hormuz were to continue for another 3 months, how will it fundamentally change the daily impact for people,
well, this will
again,
have
across the
even
globe?
larger. This will have a larger impact than the oil shock in the 1970s.
Wow.
If people remember this, that prompted a whole realignment of the world economy. And one thing that this, first of all, the world is looking at potential food shortages in the coming years. Like I mentioned earlier, now is a planting season. This is a time for the farmers to plan out their crop for the whole year. If they do not receive sufficient quantity of the chemical fertilizers, there's not going to be enough food when the harvest time comes at the end of the year. That's going to be a serious issue. That's number one. And then there's other downstream issues, like I already mentioned. Advanced chip production and industrial production. Sulfur is also a major component that's extracted from the hydrocarbon from the Persian Gulf, and sulfuric acid is used everything from car batteries to every part of the modern industrial economies. So all these, we're going to have face shortages and hyperinflation the longer the war drags on.
Right. Carl, when the U.S. says it has besieged Iran in the Persian Gulf, what does the U.S. administration actually mean? Because there's no, any exports from the Persian Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz have been halted.
You know, like I said, the Trump administration do not have any credibility at this point. When Trump said they're going to blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, it just sounds ridiculous. Well, first of all, U.S. Navy ship is not anywhere close to the Strait of Hormuz, which they're trying to avoid in order to stay outside the range of Iranian missiles. And further out, they are right now. This is just one of Trump's bluffing tactic that, as time goes on, will look increasingly ridiculous. The whole point of them waiving sanctions against Iranian and Russian oil is in order to try to increase the oil supply to the U.S. allies. What they're doing is it's totally contradictory to their prior policy. So again, like, they're scrambling. They don't really have good options here.
Yeah, I mean, given that, especially in particular, that several Iranian vessels have successfully breached the blockade, the American blockade, in the Persian Gulf, not the Strait of Hormuz, as you mentioned, because U.S. warships can't approach the Strait of Hormuz, so they put their blockade about 200 kilometers away from the Strait of Hormuz. But given that several Iranian vessels have breached that blockade, what does that tell us? I mean, who has the tactical?
First of all, 90% of the Iranian oil export still goes to China. I mean, for United States to practice a naval blockade of China's energy supply, that's an act of war. If United States cannot take on Iran in Persian Gulf, forget about taking on China. That's just ridiculous. Like, now no serious people, even in Washington, will entertain such a thought. I mean, to drag China directly into a military conflict, into this military conflict. I mean, that's the last thing that Washington would want.
Does China view this war as an existential threat to its interests, or perhaps a strategic opportunity to weaken its adversary, the United States?
China do not view events around the world as a zero-sum play. China would much prefer there's no war in the West Asia, so we can continue to do business. And right now, Chinese business is impacted by this war. And for U.S., for American decision makers whose whole mindset has been infected by this zero-sum game virus, they can only conceive the geopolitics as a zero-sum struggle. That's not how China view the world affair. China just want to grow its own economy. It just want to continue to provide more prosperity for its citizens. So what it sees this war and the after effect of the war as hindrances and obstacles. It's not an existential threat per se, because China do have other energy sources, noticeably from Russia, from Africa, and China is also a huge producer of energy itself. China is about 86% self-sufficient in primary energy production, and China is continually to expand its solar, wind, nuclear, hydro production. And China has been electrifying its country to move away from the reliance on hydrocarbon in transport. That's another thing that we'll see around the world, as well as wider adoption of Chinese EVs and solar panels as the price of oil continue to rise. So China, over the short term, immediate term, and long term, is going to be okay, but this is not an ideal situation for China. China rather there will be no war.
I can already see the comments below. Why are you telling Carl, or why are you pushing Carl so much on the on China? It's just that you see, Iran also didn't seek any war. Iran also wants prosperity for its people. It hasn't waged the war in 300 years. It also seeks technological advancements in AI, advancements in many industries and tech industries. Unfortunately, some of which were bombed. Some of our research universities were bombed online, although the science is still there. And that's how, I come back and say it's the same situation as China. You say China doesn't seek a war, just it's a law-abiding country. And many would. I'm just reflecting the argument from the streets of Iran, that Iran is also, didn't seek this war, never sought a war, never waged a war, has always reached out to its neighbors for peace, has always told them that U.S. interests in this region, U.S. military influence in this region does not secure this region, doesn't bring security for this region. That's the only reason, really, why I'm highlighting this point and these comparisons between Iran and China, and adding on that should Iran, and it won't, but hypothetically I was speaking, that should Iran fall, then China could be next.
China has something. Well, you are right. There are many similarities between Iran and China. Both are inheritor of ancient civilizations. Both are trying to pursue its own independent foreign policy. And China's official position has always been, we do not want war, but we're not afraid of war. If you're going to bring war to our door, we're going to smash you down. We're going to fight you to the end. This is why China has nuclear weapons. China developed its nuclear weapon in the 1960s. Despite at the time China was facing famine, it was very desperately poor country, but China developed nuclear weapons because they understand U.S. empire can only be faced down with threat of force. China now possesses the capability to deliver nuclear-tipped missiles anywhere in the continental United States. That itself is a huge deterrent to stop U.S. from having thoughts of its mischief in China's neighborhood. And if China continues to develop its arsenals of weapons, again, I mentioned they are primarily for defense, but for around China's neighborhood. And those missiles, the Chinese missiles, present a credible threat to the U.S. military asset throughout the region. Those are the strong deterrent. And I would think one of the war in West Asia has shown is that U.S. bases actually quite vulnerable to the missile attacks. And the fact that United States cannot even handle Iran, it's a fantasy to think that U.S. will be able to handle China, which has magnitude more missiles and more advanced missiles in its arsenal.
Iran is a superpower, according to the New York Times, or has proven itself to be a superpower. So I wouldn't go as far as saying the fact that the United States hasn't been even able to handle Iran, because Iran does have, I mean, again, with all the Chinese help, but it is an indigenous missile program at the end of the day that Iran started, and we saw the results in across the region, across the Persian Gulf. It's not nuclear armed, and that's for a reason, which I won't get into here. But like China, I won't get into here. But we're in the final days of this ceasefire, which is set to expire on Wednesday. So we're very close. The negotiations appear to be quite weak. I don't think we're going to get there. It looks like there might be a resumption of war. What do you think? And if the war does resume, who has the upper hand here?
Well, as I mentioned, U.S. pursues this war with no clear goals, with no clear objectives, and no clearly achievable objectives. This is they have shown they have totally failed in their attempt to create a regime change in Iran. And now Trump administration is desperately trying to find an off-ramp. But at the same time, it's very hard for U.S. to swallow this defeat because, for Iranian side, they would want a guarantee of Iran's security to resolve this conflict, that including withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the region and waiving of all sanction against Iran and war preparation, and United States accept Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, all these demands, if were met, this would mean complete defeat of the U.S. empire in West Asia. This is why the negotiation has dragged on as long as it did. And you have seen the mood swing from Trump in his, True Social post. And if the war does drag on, again, United States does not have a way to bring this war to a conclusion that would to its own satisfaction. This was, I think, even Trump administration have realized by now this was a mistake. This was, this is not something that U.S. This whole war was a mistake in terms of achieving U.S. objective of maintaining its hegemony in the region. But again, people in Washington will be very reluctant to give up on the whole project of U.S. primacy all over the globe. So it's really hard to predict the future,
Yeah.
and I don't really know whether this because what the Washington is also famous for is to dug in its heel and continue its mistake, even though they knew it's a mistake. This happened during the Vietnam War when Pentagon knew that the Vietnam War is not a war the U.S. could win. Yet there was no political courage in Washington to say, okay, time to pack up and go home, that the war dragged on for years. And that's what I'm actually afraid of, that because of the lack of indecision, because of the indecision in Washington, this war could drag on longer than anybody could expect it.
Right. I was going to ask you, what do you think is going to happen on Wednesday? That's the day when the ceasefire ends, but I won't, considering what you've just said. Which side do you think benefited the most from this this ceasefire, this pause?
Well, I think, as long as Iran maintains its control on the Strait of Hormuz, the initiative is on the Iranian side. This is a core issue that United States has no control over because they have no way to challenge the Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. This is why Trump has been crying to NATO on why Europeans are not doing more to help. But the fact is, if United States, the largest force in the NATO, cannot do anything about it, there's not much couple French or German ship is going to help. It's going to add to that. So at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a very bitter pill for Washington to swallow, to admit to their own defeat. I hope they swallow, but that's just my hope. I don't know. I really don't know how deranged the Trump administration can be. It's impossible to predict at this point.
If you were a gambling man, which I assume you're not, I think you're not, how do you think this scenario is going to unfold? Will there be another extension of the ceasefire, or will the war resume or will there be perhaps just confrontation as the status quo currently is in the Strait of Hormuz?
It's my hope that there will be a deal and U.S. just walk away with tails between its legs. But with the Trump administration, it's really hard to predict. I'm not a gambling man, but the problem is Trump is, and there's a possibility. I think what more likely, leading up to Wednesday, is that Trump will become increasingly unhinged on his true social post. He will continually increasing his threat, and it will rile up the U.S. market, and of course, then Trump will have to come out with totally contradictory message about a negotiation is still on track. So I suspect this negotiation will likely drag on a little bit longer, and it's likely that ceasefire will get extended. And I'm not too optimistic at this point. A final settlement will be reached. I think it's just, as I mentioned, the demands from the both sides right now, it's just there's such a large gap. From the U.S. side, it's a demand of removal of enriched uranium from Iran, and from Iran side, this means U.S. withdrawal from West Asia. So we're gonna have to wait and see. My guess is that this negotiation will continue, and the ceasefire will be extended even longer.
Carl, thank you very much indeed. We always love to have you on the show, and your insights, your perspectives, your narratives, and are always very intriguing and very much appreciated. Thank you very much, Carl Zha, the geopolitical analyst and the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. So now, if you do enjoy our content and want to continue receiving wartime analysis, don't forget to subscribe to our new YouTube channel. You can also help us via Stripe to continue the journey, our journey. The links in the description for Stripe. Every little bit helps. We are being targeted and censored, unfortunately. So thank you for tuning in to Iran Talks. Don't miss our next episode.
Iran.